I'd like to begin by expressing my most sincere gratitude, thanks to Adrian, to Armando, for their hospitality, for their generosity, and for the honor of the invitation to be here with you this afternoon. In addition, I'd like to highlight the presence of my compañera Rosemary Rojas. She's an indigenous leader who, in recent years, have accompanied me in our struggle, in our cause. But she also has been a fighter for the rights of women, especially a woman in the agricultural fields. Often when we think about agriculture, we think about men, we think about compañeros, but we, don't realize that women represent almost 50% of the labor force that depend on migrant labor, and especially in the fields. Those of us present here, and including the ones in the other side of the screen, the one connected through Zoom, all of us here have something in common. I mean, probably many things that is very evident. We have survived the pandemic. Well, at least as of now. Like we say in Mexico, no hay que cantar victoria. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown us again the devastation and the moral nature of the capitalist system. And we, the people of this country, have suffered this nature of capitalism in a very and terrible, devastating way. With the largest number of deaths of this, almost 7 million people who have died in the world, the United States was first, ranked first, with more than 1 million deaths. Even above countries like Mexico, Mexico only have about 330-something thousand deaths. Canada, less than 54,000 deaths. Just to name the neighbors of the United States. The country with the most disputed first place with the United States was Brazil, with 700,000 deaths. And due to the erratic public health policy of former President Jair Bolsonaro, a delusional admirer of Donald Trump, with whom he shared his extreme right-wing beliefs, bordering in almost a fascist ideology. In other words, one of the capitalist social formations, as Professor Richard D. Wolff and Stephen Resnick of Hamster prefer to call it, capitalist social formation instead of society, because societies do not tell the story of what we have today. One of the most advanced planets with his enormous material accumulation, with his systems of research and centralization of knowledge, and its overwhelming technology means could not save the lives of more than 1 million human beings. The most advanced planet, country on the planet, will not save the lives of 1 million human beings. And deaths were not only told of the pandemic management. COVID-19 not only caused suffering and grief in American homes, it also caused a tremendous breakdown in social life, education, and culture. It brought economic hardship to all households due to the reduction of income that result in problems of food insecurity, loss of housing, and breakdown of family, already so fragile in these complicated modern times. Drug addiction, violence, and criminality increase. And of course, there were sectors of the population that were disproportionately affected by the pandemic because they were already suffering from a system of social exclusion and marginalization. I refer, of course, to those at the bottom, women and single mothers, especially migrants and impoverished families, people of color, and Native American communities. Domestic and external violence against women increased in the absence of public protective services and the indifference of public opinion. The elderly confined to poorly serviced nursing homes or lonely in their homes, abandoned by their daughters and sons, were the main victims of the terrible pandemic. Children suffered the collateral damage of the tragedy of the pandemic. Even environmental devastation accelerators increased. Yes, many people were saying that since there were already very few cars in the streets, that there was less population and fewer gas emissions. But the truth is that the pandemic also increased the consumerist culture, especially since there were apparent disruptions in the supply chain, and the population took to the streets to shop madly in fear of shortages of basic and non-basic items, as it happened during the failed end of the world back in 1999. The big commercial monopolies then have a very perverse idea. They came up with the idea of opening their doors very early in the morning only for people like my age. I confess, I happened to be shivering from the cold a little bit after 5 a.m. in a very long line of elderly people, some moving slowly with their walkers, waiting outside Costco. I was attempting to buy a small bag of pinto beans. Those who could afford to buy in bulk ransacked the store shelves and crammed their cupboards with goods, most of which eventually ended up in the dumpsters. The migrant farm workers in the border region, with whom Rosemary and I have been working for many years, suffered contagions and untold loss of lives, such as we will never imagine before, that we will see, the tragedy of losing all these workers. And it's not that they were well before the pandemic. They were not, On the contrary, they were already suffering from historic marginalization and exclusion. But the pandemic intensified their marginalization and their exclusion. Amado Martinez was our first compañero to die on March 14, 2020, after a long month of being hospitalized. He was followed by many others. Migrant farm workers were suddenly qualified as essential workers who had to continue producing the food necessary for the population to face the pandemic. like if they were not essential workers before. Well, COVID-19 strategy included shutting down certain sectors of our economy, and thousands of workers and employees were sent home. Agriculture workers, along with other sectors of our community, like healthcare workers, nurses, mainly maintenance workers of the hospitals, all of them, were mandated to continue working. But of course, the strategy against COVID-19 was basically designed by the domestic security and military sectors. Very little involvement of the health and science sectors. So its focus, the focus of the United States strategy to deal with COVID-19 was basically to protect the material infrastructure and economic sectors of our human lives. Anyway, the point is that COVID-19 came to clarify even more the limitations and the real essence of capitalism. I have more than 4 years organizing agriculture workers in the United States-Mexico border in an attempt to change the reality of oppression and exploitation that they have suffered forever, and that prevails to this day. So for us, the issue of labor is at the core of our political and organizing efforts. We begin organizing farm workers with the intention to push them to build a collective force that would enable them to end the conditions of oppression and exploitation. But that idea was very naive. We were following the model implemented by Cesar Chavez in California, which itself comes from the organizing model developed by Letelier-Moffitt through the historic Industrial Areas Foundation Institute in Chicago. The task was to talk to the workers, to convince them to pressure their bosses through labor stoppages and protests until they agreed to negotiate their demands for better wages and better working conditions. And once achieved these objectives, we will all live happily for the rest of our life. That was the motto. But life is not a fairy tale. In 1992, after 2 years of intense organizing and struggle, we won the first collective bargaining agreement in Mexico agricultural fields that included many advances, including no use of pesticides in the fields. Wages were improved somewhat, and the contract had a hopeful effect because although they only cover a group of workers, employers from the region had to improve the salaries too, because the workers started to complain, why are these workers earning more than us? So it had an effect on the region where we are. But the contract ended a year after the employer decided not to continue planting. And the employer reasoned, rather than getting rid of a collective bargaining agreement with a group of poor Mexican farm workers who dared to defy him, were consideration about prices in the market, the prices for agricultural products. Farmers don't farm if they don't see the possibility of at least having their investment, back. Once the contract was terminated, we returned to the preliminary point of the organizing work that we had begun in 1983. And we has not stopped, and that continues even today. More than 30 years later, I can tell you that we have made many achievements, but the balance is not positive. And we would like to tell you, exploitation and oppression of workers continue to be the order of the day. Even in California, with the powerful movement of Cesar Chavez. Just watch the news, and you will learn about the wages in the fields and on the farms or in the ranches that are basically starving wages. We hear about the increasingly frequent exposures of highly hazardous chemicals, or that they are not even given water to drink in the fields. And we read about deaths of farm workers in the field due to the exposure of extreme temperatures during this past summer, simply because there are no laws and regulations that force employers to even a break to these workers to protect from the heat. It seems the situation and conditions of migrant farm workers in America have not only, or in a region, but in America in general, have not only not changed, but have worse, becoming worse. And to us, it's clear that our struggle need to be not against a bad and greedy agriculture industry, but has to be a struggle against capital. Today, we have a divided and confused working class that cannot find a way out of its basic problems. And if it does were not enough, working class today faces a public environment of general indifference. And here I would like to ask you the first question for your consideration. Why, after so many years of organizational efforts, the struggles of farm workers in America are, well-known, historic, inspiring. Why is that the conditions of agriculture are so bad and deteriorated in these times? We think, and is what we think, I don't know what you think, that everything that we have done and continue to done up to now, as important as it has been or continues to be, has not really disrupted the social relations of capital production, under which a small group of people appropriate the values produced by the blood, sweat, and tears of the dispossessed majority. And I want to tell you why I use the word dispossessed instead of poor people. Poor people can mean a lot of things. Poor people can mean that people are lazy, that people don't want to work, that people cannot find work, that's why they're, or maybe that God wants them to be poor. I use the word dispossessed to make the point that people are poor because somebody took everything from them. People are dispossessed. People like where my family come were dispossessed and were taking away the capacity to feed their families and their communities. And the present economies were destroyed. So to us, the question of labor from our point of view must be the starting point of the analysis, debate, proposal, and efforts of all those who aspire to improve the living condition or the most marginalized and excluded. Within this issue, it is necessary to turn our attention to the revolutionary and transformative ideas that often we put aside, and consequently, the weight of this devastating and deadly capitalism is presented to us as something intangible and unattainable. This is why one thinker, no one agrees whether it was Frederick Jameson or Slavoj Žižek, made the lapidary question of whether it's easier to imagine the end of humanity than the end of capitalism. Naturally, of course, in this area, currently called the post-truth area, as well as with the overproduction of ideas and concepts, many of which come from sectors clearly identified with safeguarding those capitalist relations of production, it is also necessary to identify the tools of oppression and domination that make those social relations of production possible. Two of them, which are fundamental and must be confronted, are the patriarchal system of violence against women and racism. You know what they are. We can spend all day talking about patriarchy and racism. I know that Rosemary can speak hours and hours, telling you about this tool of oppression of the patriarchy system. But the point is that today, these two very important aspects are trivialized by society. So we don't notice. The idea is that if we close our eyes, everything is fine in America. In fact, I know people, friends of mine, well-educated friends of mine, that did not start talking about racism until George Floyd was killed. And I had to explain to him that the foundation of this country were the occupation and the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of African people that were kidnapped in Africa and were brought to establish a system of slavery in this country that made possible the flourishing of capitalism. So we think that we cannot move a process of transition from capital social relations to something different without confronting these two tools of oppression. But at the same time, the other side of the coin is that we cannot confront them if we don't move our efforts or direction to a transitional movement, to an emancipational movement. So both things are connected. We cannot deal with an emancipatory goal without confronting these two very important tools of oppression and exploitation. And in the same token, in order to move to that emancipatory goal, we have to confront those. We think that the answers to the above questions are very important to solve the fundamental problem for a systemic transition, and that we must have the capacity and the disposition to elaborate them. Because I know that maybe there's some questions and answers, I would like to end my presentation quoting an Italian revolutionary on how to confront capitalism and how to push for transition. I have taken this quote from for my compañero Álvaro Salgado, a Mexican who for many years has accompanied indigenous peoples and peasants in the defense of their life, their territory, their culture, their environment, and their natural resources. The quote is from Antonio Gramsci. Let's instruct ourselves, because we are going to need all our intelligence. Let us mobilize ourselves, because we are going to need all our enthusiasm. And let's organize ourselves, because we are going to need all of our strength. Mm-hmm. Muchas gracias.
Hola, Carlos. Muchas gracias. Yo soy Lola. Hi. I'm going to switch to English now, but I'm going to say hi in Spanish. You made a really important question, right? You were saying that after, doing a lot of organizing for many years, you see things, the working conditions haven't changed for farm workers. And we can say that for a lot of workers in the US, right? And you said that I had to deal with, following partially the Alinsky model of organizing. So I wanted to ask you to say more about that. Like, what ways can we move forward with our organizing, with our actions that are more disruptive of relations of production capital and not follow, like, what other ways can we organize? Which other ways have you organized that move away from that model, which is so predominant in the US? Y puedo preguntarlo en español, si prefiero. Sí.
Yes,
sí, no, lo que decía es un poco como que vos hablaste del modelo Alinsky, ¿no? Y sus limitaciones. Entonces yo te preguntaba un poco sobre cómo podemos movernos hacia un modelo que disrumpa más las relaciones, un modelo de organizing, de organizar y que disrumpa más las relaciones del capital. O sea, como si querías decir un poco más sobre tu crítica a la experiencia de seguir el modelo de Alinsky, básicamente. So.
There's another person.
Go ahead. Como dándole seguimiento a su pregunta también, mucho gusto, Stephanie Salgado, soy la organizadora comunitaria de Voces de las Fronteras acá. Originalmente soy de Honduras y gracias por su presentación y las palabras que ha dicho, porque no se oye mucho de esto. Uno mucho habla de lo que está pasando a nivel como aquí, ahora, y no vemos a veces lo sistemático. Y eso lo digo en base en lo que yo he sido expuesta a una comunidad inmigrante de trabajadores y que están, digamos, en la lechería aquí en Madison o en todo Wisconsin. Y yo he tratado como de hablarles de una manera eso, de por qué es importante movilizarse o organizarse, pero también ellos decían, digamos, una economía fuerte y como la que tienen los Estados Unidos es lo que ocupan nuestros países, pero nuestros países nunca llegarían a ese punto si no se vuelven como Estados Unidos, capitalistas. Entonces, yo tratando de mediar estas conversaciones con él ha sido difícil. Imagino que usted ha tenido esa experiencia y le quería preguntar qué sería su sugerencia para llevar a cabo estas conversaciones de una manera respetuosa y también de una manera como real y no como decirle como yo sé más que vos. Más en serio sería como tener una conversación respecto a lo que acaba de decir ahorita.
Okay. So I'm going to go to your question. I'm going to continue organizing agricultural workers, probably to the end of my life. Even though I know, that we will make gains, that we will advance, that we will have some increases, but I need to always keep in mind that don't change exploitation and oppression, because that's, that's the essence of the system.
Mm-hmm.
That don't mean that we're gonna give up. We will continue fighting, even if it's a 5 cents increase on the bucket of chile, I'm gonna fight for that 5 cents increase with all my power and all my strength. But we need to keep always in mind that the strategy should be a transformation of the reality.
Mm-hmm.
Let me tell you something. I started to organize agriculture workers in the 80s. And I'm not now organizing the children of those farm workers. You know, the issues that we were fighting in the 80s are the same issues that we are fighting today. The abuses, the people not being treated as human beings in the fields. And let me tell you something today, and Rosemary can tell you, we have a situation more complicated than in the past. In the area where we are organizing, we have about 600 or more of farm workers that are called the contratados. Those are the H-2A workers. And now we have to deal with a situation where we have tension between the contratados and the local workers. Dr. Kitty Calavita from California, she wrote a really beautiful book. And one of the main points she does is that the system used immigration to divide working class. So what we have now these days in New Mexico and Salem and Garfield, what we have is a confrontation between Mexicanos. So that's the reality that we face. But let me go a little bit, more about, your question. The experience of the farm labor is similar to the labor movement, a deep connection with the political parties. A deep connection with the political parties. And often, we put the future of working people in the hands of the political parties. That means that we don't believe that the workers can change the system. We are hoping for somebody else on the top to come and change the system. These days, the main villain, the worst person, Mr. Donald Trump, is the target of everybody. And often we forgot the atrocities of the Democrats. No? When the first caravans of migrants started, we went to Mexico City.
Right.
In the fall of 2018. And people were telling us, why all these people from Honduras are leaving their country, attempting to enter the United States? What's wrong with those people? And we started to remind everybody about the military coup in 2009 in Honduras. By the way, the Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton, and the Vice President was Mr. Biden. A military coup that was planned by United States, by the American Embassy in Tegucigalpa. And what was the result of that military coup? The increase of violence in Honduras. The taking over of land. We were in Honduras, and, it was amazing to see all these campesinos and campesinas working at night in their fields because during the day were not safe. During the day, they were attacked by the military, by paramilitaries, by all these kinds of groups. So why is that we cannot, do a struggle for workers and on behalf of workers, independent from those on the top. You know? So that's a very important point. How can we, deal with that situation? We have to start being serious about the political formation of workers.
Mm.
It's not enough that all of us here talk about these issues, and we don't talk about these issues with the workers. Let me tell you an experience that I have. Everybody knows about the socialist camp all in the 90s. All my leftist friends suddenly were disappointed. They become very sad. Oh, se cayó el socialismo, they would say. Actually, I was not sad. I was happy because all those friends gave me their books. A lot of them abandoned their ideas. A lot of them went to work to nonprofit organizations. I have a friend who was so radical that I was always impressed of this friend. And he now works for an anti-hunger nonprofit organization. I have another friend who works in an anti-poor nonprofit organization. And I always tell him, the only poverty that you have solved is your own poverty. Do you know that we now have more poor in America than when Mr. Johnson started the anti-poverty war, the war against poverty? We now have more poor people. Anyway, so I got all these books. Some of these books were new. They never opened their books. But some were with all these notes, marginal notes, which was very, very good for me because I don't want to read the whole book. I wanted to read the most important parts of the book. Anyway, the book that I really loved on those boxes of book that I got was one by Karl Marx, Trabajo Asalariado y Capital, Wage, Labor, and Capital. And you know what that book is about? It's about the talks that Karl Marx was giving to workers so they can understand the system. And therefore, by understanding the capitalist system, the machinery, how goods and surplus value and all these things work, that they understand that they have to change it. That they have to fight, of course, for better wages, better working conditions, to resolve all these problems of inequality, but that they needed to take care in their own hands the solution to the most important problem, which is the social relations of production. A handful of people that accumulates wealth at the expenses of the exploitation and oppression of the majority of people. So we need to go, and I know that is very hard. There's some workers that tell us, Carlos, eso nunca se va a poder, Estados Unidos nunca va a cambiar, Carlos. But we need to convince them. We need to convince the H2A workers and the local workers that they are class of workers, that they are being exploited the same, that if they are competing against each other, it's not their fault. Somebody is making them compete in order to keep them disorganized and divided, in order to prevent them building the collective force that they need in order to change the reality of oppression. The same thing that we had started to do a long time ago. The oppression of women in the field was terrible. sexual harassment. Rosemary can tell you sexual harassment, the rapes, everything were happening in the fields. And the male workers were saying nothing about it. In fact, there was some male workers that will tell us, pues es que ya se los buscan. They get close to the farm labor contractors. And we start to work with them, tell them, no, look, if somebody can oppress women, abuse of the rights of women in the fields, you're gonna be the one losing. It's in your own interest to defend the rights of your compañeras in the fields. And it's what we are doing now, but we have to, in the most clear and simple ways, make them understand how the system works. And they need to change, to make changes. And some of the workers understand. Some of the workers are tell us, ¿y cómo le hacemos, Carlos? We don't know, but we have to push in that direction. So what we tell the workers is that they need to understand that nobody is going to change society or the way things are from them, that they have to do it. Not the Democratic Party, not now. That does not mean that we don't participate in politics. Actually, we were, supporting Bernie Sanders the first time. But it was not because we wanted Bernie Sanders to become president. It was because the candidacy of Bernie Sanders was creating a current of public opinion that we wanted to take advantage of. And we wanted to, to bring certain ideas to that current, For example, one thing that bothers many people is, yes, if we get rid of this system, what are we going to build? What kind of social formation is going to replace the current one? That's something that, even the most advanced leftists do not understand. Hacia dónde vamos? Immanuel Wallenstein used to tell us there's going to be a transition in 50 years, but we don't know what kind of transition we're going to have. Therefore, we need to participate. We need to be involved in that transitional process. So yes, it's very hard. It's very complicated. Now, the limitation that I was talking about, the model of Cesar Chavez, and following the model of Solalinsky, is that the main focus is that the struggle is tied to the struggle for power, for political power. And we know that that means sometimes, getting close to the political parties and to the electoral struggle. There's no way that in the United States, an electoral struggle can bring deep changes. And the reason is because the majority of us don't vote. And because, for example, in El Paso, we are 80% of the population. Any strategy based on the electoral struggle will exclude most of the people there. So this is what I was referring. That does not mean that we don't fight for the day-to-day issues affecting our people. But we need to keep in mind that it's not enough to deal with the effects. We need to start addressing the causes of those effects. Even Pope Francis kept saying, I don't know if you're Catholic or not, but all of you, him separate people with will, with faith, good people. But he say in 2018 is not enough. Is not enough to deal with the day-to-day problems. We have to go to the structural causes of the problems. And we have to do that. And we have to make the workers understand that. And I bet you that a lot of farm workers in the United States will understand that because they have seen the destruction of their peasant economies in Mexico.
Thank you for that, Carlos. At first, we have a question, a few questions from folks joining us virtually. John Peck has asked, the university is another focus of this struggle. We have had our academics study our grassroots movements, and then that information is often extracted and exploited by the state to corrupt and suppress our social change work. What would you suggest for academics who want to genuinely support our activism and not have their work abused in this way? So that's question one. And then I'll take one more question before I bring it back to our present audience. From Parwat Regmi, he writes, what have been some of the most impactful methods you have learned about in your organizing to push for change from grassroots as well as policymaking levels?
Okay, the first question by John Peck, I think that somebody here who is academic should answer that question. But I have an idea. I think that, that we really need to make sure that the academic institutions understand that if they aspire to a social change, to a real deep social transformation of society, they need to go out of their buildings. They need to go out of their buildings and, go out and, and see the reality, what's going on in this country. We have relationships with, for example, with some members of the University of Texas in El Paso, with NMSU. And we are always telling them, you want to do a good academic job, don't isolate inside your buildings. Go and see the reality of what's going on. Also, it's very important that academic institutions understand the world today. Seems like there's no understanding of the world today. Let me give you one example. Nobody knows in the United States what to do with immigration today. Nobody knows. The only thing that people does is to have compassion, to provide some bottles of water to the people dying in the desert. 140 since since May. 140 people, migrants who have died in the desert. The last two were two women who lost their lives in the New Mexico area. And you know why? Because most of the academic institutions don't see migration as an act of resistance. Most of the academics see migration as as pobrecitos, se tienen que venir. But the most powerful act of resistance today is migration. Millions of people, of dispossessed people, as we say, are defying, challenging the system. So to us, it's an act of resistance. When you refuse to push this, to be pushed by the system to disappear as women, as campesina, as indigenous people, you are resistant. And the millions of migrants that are coming since that have been coming since 2019, have defied, have challenged the capitalist system, United States. There was a group of from Honduras, and this woman, actually we have just passed a statement of solidarity, and we took the statement of solidarity, and the woman said, muchas gracias, and she put it aside. And you know what she asked for? She was asking for a map of Mexico. The statements of solidarity were not of service. They wanted to have a map. So we were telling them, did you know what is waiting in 2018? Do you know what is waiting for you in the border? And they knew. They said, yes, we know what is going on in the border. Mr. Trump sent all the soldiers to the border to stop us. And yet you continue to walk toward the border. Why? Because maybe, will take us, several weeks to get there. And maybe at that time, the troops will be tired and will leave. Or maybe Mr. Trump will change his heart and he will, just open the border for us. So there was a conviction. They were following a conviction to be in the border regardless of the militarization of the border, regardless of the threat of the National Guard, of the military, and still they were walking towards the north. That's an act of resistance. You don't see an act of resistance in the United States today from any sectors of society. The most important today, we should learn from the migrants. Let's say that suddenly you don't have nothing. You lose everything, your home, your family, everything. What are you gonna do? Who you're gonna ask for guidance, a migrant or a sociologist? The migrant will tell you how to survive. The sociologist will write a book about you. And then you will not be able even to read it. The most expensive books are in the universities. You cannot access those books. And they write about us. But we cannot get those books. But anyway, I think that John Peck is he's very tied to the family farm defender movement. I think that John Peck understands that every member of academic institutions have a responsibility towards humanity, and especially to those on the bottom. And they should, fight, even if the institutions are putting pressure, they have to fight to be of service to humanity. And in the case of the migrants and the farm workers, we will be happy the day when we see people from the academic institutions coming to us with a disposition to serve and to help. Not to save us, but to help, to be our friends, to be there with us. The other question was
about some of the most impactful methods you found in your organizing work.
Well, the most important is when we use the examples. When we use the examples, so workers fighting for their rights. For example, we know that that here in this state, the fight to protect collective bargaining rights was very important at one point. So we use these examples the workers need to know that they are not alone, that there's, people fighting all over the place to make meaningful changes to what we have today. Romy has been in many communities, and the experiences that she has brought to our border region from Africa, from Central America, from the Caribbean are very powerful, because then, the woman understand that there's, that they are not alone, that they suffer oppression, that there's oppression all over the place, but that there's very important struggles, going on today. In the case of public policies, I don't have experience, and I'm going to tell you the truth. I have allergies to politicians. I think that Cesar Chavez once said, and that's very important. He said that passing a law and a regulation is very easy. You just fight all these years, and finally you accomplish the law and regulation. Putting in practice laws and regulations, protection of workers is the complicated part. Today also is very important to realize that we have a very important threat to our rights. In the case of Texas, as you know, we have a governor and some politicians that are even more radical than Donald Trump. And in the last years, there's been a very serious attack against sexual and reproductive rights of women, and also against the voting rights of people of color. And we have to fight to preserve, those rights. But it's complicated. It's complicated because, we depend on politicians that, that are, that have political ambitions, even if they are two people, And today, the balance of power within the political institutions is to the right. But there's nothing that prevents us, for example, after the government decided to end the pandemic by decree, because they say that, well, let's end the pandemic. Anyway, less people dying every day. There have been no discussion on public health systems in United States. I don't hear any debate, because something that was clear to us at the beginning of the pandemic is that the public health systems of this country exclude the majority of the population. So that debate has to go on, but nothing prevents us from building our own public health systems within our families and our communities. We don't have to wait for the politicians to do it for ourselves.
Any questions from our present audience?
Hello, my name is Xavier Bisabaros-Huraf. Thank you so much for talking here. But so my background is really working, or like my family were just in the rural, like southeastern Wisconsin. And a really big thing that we have been really trying, we have a small meat business basically. And like what I guess, so I'm putting together their words here, is like cutting out the middleman. So instead of having people go to Costco, buy things online through Amazon, all these things that disconnect you from the workers, from the actual source, from these businesses, is that we work with basically small farmers. We make and like process their meat, and then we give it back to them. So people can go to their farms and see everything and then buy it directly from the source. And so my question was kind of like, do you think that cutting out this middleman would help workers and bringing really consumers closer to the source where the food is, where the people are, where the workers are. Would this help the system, the workers, all that really, so people can see what's really happening?
Yeah. I don't want to disappoint you. But I want to take the issue of what is called small farmers, family farmers. At the end of the day, it's business. And the system is sustained by business, whether it's small or big. We need to think about other venues to make sure that we produce food and that food goes to the people that need food. We also have to and we are in a good moment of our history in the United States. We have to start questioning some very important aspects of American life. One very important is the issue of private property. As you know, in Mexico, we used to have the ejido system. But then with the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, the United States imposed to Mexico the reform of Article 27 of the Constitution that used to give the communities the ownership of land and natural resources. But here in America, we have the private property system, individual owners of land. The average amount of land in the United States is something like 400 acres of land. The average in Honduras, for example, and I'm not talking about Mexico, Honduras, is 8 acres of land. So can we build something different when we have that contradiction, that disparity? No. Small farmers in the United States have exemptions, and often those exemptions are used to exploit workers, to exploit migrant workers. So it's very important that we demystify, demystificar.
Yes.
Small farming. If you farm yourself and you have to use somebody else to do the job, because I don't imagine somebody here farming 400 acres alone. Have to use labor, maybe your family, but that's also exploitation. If you put your kids to work, your farm, you're exploiting them. It's child labor. Or, you exploit your brother-in-law or your sister-in-law. But anyway, the point is that we have to think about another model of social protections. And, and it's very complicated here. Because small farmers depend from the United States Department of Agriculture. And the United States Department of Agriculture is one of the entities used by, big capital to maintain the system. If you go to USDA and you go and tell an officer, look, I need money to buy a piece of land so I can produce food for my people in my community. You will not get it. You will be told to go to the University of Wisconsin and develop a business plan, a feasibility plan, and all these things. We need to start thinking about another way, another type of society. I used to have a good friend here in Wisconsin. John Peck was very close to him. Jan Killman was a very old. He died. We used to be together in many activities. And every time I was with John Killman, he would bring me a box of cheese. And he would give it. Toma, Carlos, mira, está acá. Really great cheese from Wisconsin. And I remember that once somebody told him, hey, John, don't give away your cheese, because one day you're going to be broke. You are giving away my cheese. And he said, I'm farming so I can give my cheese to the people that, that love my cheese, that enjoy my cheese. So he was thinking on that terms. He was not thinking on terms of how much money I can make with my cheese. So we need to start thinking about new features of the type of society that we want to build. I was in Morelia, and Romy has been in the Zapatistas community. And I was invited in Morelia, and all these people from the United States, from Europe, were part of the group. And so we have this Junta de Buen Gobierno giving us a presentation. And then one question was, I think the main question was, what is your model of agriculture production? That was the question. And they were watching, they were consulting to each other. And the men say, les vamos a explicar. We're going to explain. And everybody got their notes and their iPads and everything to start talking. Our model is that we produce food for our family. Then second, we produce food for our community. And third, we produce food for the caracoles. Another question? And that's exactly the essence of changing. We need to move to change the model of agriculture production in the United States, because it's not satisfying the nutrition needs of the population, especially of those sectors that don't have the means to buy food.
Carlos, we have a question from RGB LJC. So I'm going to ask them to unmute, and they are joining us virtually. So RGB LJC, please ask your question.
¿Qué tal, Carlos? Saludos, abrazo acá del sur de Texas. Un gusto escucharte. La verdad, hago la pregunta en inglés para que todos entiendan. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about, you've been around organizing for a while, about how nonprofits have served sometimes, many times, the nonprofit sector and the support sector, especially for farm workers, as tools to assimilate and domesticate popular struggles. And we've seen that como que aplacan a la lucha a veces al movimiento popular. If you have anything to share on that, that would be great.
Okay, but first I'd like to clarify that I'm not against nonprofit organizations. Especially they are good. We are very close to a peasant organization from IT. Yeah. And once I asked the leader of that organization, Asociación Campesina, IT, I asked him, what's wrong with IT? Seems like every day the situation is worse in IT instead of improving. And he told me, Carlos, you know what is our main problem in IT? No, what is? That we have 1,000 NGOs. That's the main problem that we have. So, the system will develop all these tools to protect, the relations of production. And one of those tools is to give us money. to give us money, to supposedly resolve the problems of the population. And that's the truth. So, and I can tell you because we have a nonprofit organization. One that until very recently that we stopped asking for money from foundations. Because we will spend most of our time responding to foundations than to the members of our organization. So what are the main intention of many reforms, of many public policies that we have? Is to disarm working people from, pay attention to the changes that need to take place in the structure of this terrible model of production. I remember that one of the most important organizations in the Rio Grande Valley was the Texas Farm Workers Union. I was part of the Texas Farm Workers Union for several years. And the critique of the Texas Farm Workers, again, the Texas Farm Workers Union was that the TFW was not only seeking reforms, seeking programs. The Texas Farm Workers Union was, for example, seeking the end of use of pesticides in the field, period, regardless whether, they were needed or not. Not how to use it in emergency situations in the fields, in the farming agriculture. In another radical ideas. But at the same time, the situation in the Rio Grande Valley was very, very, very complicated. The levels of poverty, for example, in Hidalgo County, were terrible. So people will get everything that they can get, whether it was from the nonprofit organizations or the church. I remember that nonprofit organizations and the church was competing against each other to deliver food. And I remember that the Texas Farm Workers Union was telling the workers, take the food, but don't forget that one day you need to have an income that allows you to buy your own food and not to be dependent from these nonprofit organizations or the church or anybody else. You need to be independent. You need to reserve an income that brings you dignity to your life. So, the nonprofit world plays a very important role. And we need to push those nonprofits to respect the dignity of people, the workers, and everybody, and to make anything, pointed to a strategy that goes beyond dealing with the effects of the problem that we face, or that our people face, our communities face. But they might mean that the IRS will come after you.
The IRS comes for all. I do know that there might have been a question behind me.
Oh, Adrian.
Oh, sorry, behind me?
Yeah.
To my left.
Yeah.
And yes, and to the young lady across the.
Thank you again for so talking about the unity of workers and how immigration is used to divide workers from I guess and about the children of the migrants that you organized in the 80s. Do you think there is any potential right now to organize these children who are now workers, who are now adults, into more than just an economic force, more than just collective bargaining, but into like a political force, to like merge the economic struggle with the political struggle and take it away from just the fields, and in collaboration with like local labor unions that represent citizen workers to try and like I guess, cut off dependency on not only NGOs, but also the Democratic Party. Because for trade unions, a lot of the time, in a similar way, they're very dependent on their relationship with the Democratic Party. And all the union do is go to the Democratic Party and often don't produce a lot of results for the rank and file. So yeah, do you think there's any potential to merge the economic and the political struggle in kind of like whether that's a council or an actual formal political party? Yeah, open-ended question.
Yes. Okay, so very quick. We need to go beyond economic issues affecting people. The trade unions are very important organizations because they unite workers in certain sectors, but they don't go beyond economic issues. And they have convinced, union members that the economic issue is the most important. That's why a lot of union members don't want to belong to union because they don't see the economic gain. We need to educate workers that it goes beyond economic issues. The cultural aspect is very important. The political aspect that you mentioned, the independent, political aspect is very important. But also the issue of climate crisis that we are facing is very important. Actually, it's the most important. So I think that we need to push in the organizations to go beyond economic demands, that they have to include everything, because everything is part of what keeps these social relations of production. And we have to show the connection, Today, there's no way that one sector of working class can make deep changes without, taking into account the different issues that involve our own oppression and, the serious situation that we're facing today.
And the contribution that the youth have, the children.
Yeah, can you say that?
What we see right now with the youth, I think this is what you were asking about the children of the farm workers. What we see now that even though the conditions are very oppressive, and to many of us that are listening, it's like devastating and how depressing, but that's not what we see. Yes, those conditions exist, and many of us have to live through it that we're farm worker children, but now the youth are becoming so resilient, but they're also thriving because of their grandmothers and their mothers and their families that are pushing them towards the education to break this wheel of oppression. And so we have farm worker children that are at the University of New Mexico in Las Cruces. One just became a doctor, and his whole family pushed him through it. And it's such an inspiring accomplishment, because what we see is that he's going to come back and contribute to the farm worker struggle. Because up to this day, he still goes out to the fields on the weekends to work and to help his family and to pay for his room and board, because you don't get a free ride when you're a migrant. And whatever these camp programs pay might be for 1 or 2 semesters, but you're not getting a full scholarship. So you still have to work in the fields at night. And that's what I understood. So what we do when we're out there, and we hope it has, what we've seen as a rippling effect, is that we do talk about politics, but not in what you see in the newspaper, but in very basic questions to what does this mean when it comes to immigration? What does immigration reform mean? What does the militarization look like? Because they're experiencing, and we're experiencing, all these detrimental effects of the militarization, and why we need to voice, why they need to voice their opinion when it comes to this, and have it in a family discussion that starts in the kitchen, where food is sacred, and your mother is cooking the very basic food for your family. And so that's where it starts, from the inside, in your home. How do you clean your house? Well, you start on the inside and you use clean mop water because you can't use dirty mop water. So we use that kind of analogy and that kind of an understanding that we clean from the inside out. And so just by injecting these discussions, very basic discussions are so necessary, and that's where it starts. And so we see a lot of inspiring stories with the farm worker and the children, the 12-year-old that we just did a few weeks ago that had a paycheck, where he's earning money. So yes, he qualifies for the stimulus. He worked. He should have that money for school clothes or whatever they need for school, which he'll probably end up giving to his family to elevate the needs of the family. But this is, I think, where it starts and it, builds on, and we get to be there to witness this transition in history with the children that many people will never see, or nonprofit organizations will ever see, because they're not with their boots on the ground, and that is necessary. You have to go and be with your boots on the ground, surrounded by people, to learn the culture, the language, just to listen. Each time we learn so much because we just listen. We don't have a solution, but together we can all discuss this. How to protect ourselves? What do we need to do? As women, how do we need to think? We need to think like attorneys and gather evidence. We need to think as a collective, because when a lot of us have the evidence of crop dusters spraying the workers with pesticides, we have enough evidence to be able to pursue this in a different way with our allies. So this is where it starts. And it starts with many, many different ideas. And more than that, with the actions and with my supportive teacher and guide and my partner, we both learn so much on both sides of it. And so this is what it takes. So many to come together as a collective, and there's no bad ideas. Something that always sticks with me is that there's no battles that are lost. There are only battles that are abandoned, and that's Cesar Chavez. And so even though we feel like we're not winning a battle and it feels hopeless and like, where do we go from here? It's not hopeless, because the new generation, the youth that are working, that little 12-year-old working in the fields with his family, earning a paycheck, inspires us to keep moving forward. And that's where we go. And I hope I answered your question, because it kind of gives a more in-depth look at, we're not looking just at the surface. So we just have to dig deeper.
I'd like to thank you and I like to encourage to continue farming. You know why? Not because I want you to get rich, but because we need to protect Mother Earth. We need to protect the natural resources. When you go and produce food, you also have the responsibility to take care of that piece of land that is giving us the ability to live.